Welcome to Revive Ministries Podcast. As we continue into March, we are still talking about taking that first step. I'm reminded of this month, around this time of year, we're talking about Black History Month, and one notable person that I kind of think about is Rosa Parks. She says it this way: I've learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, this diminishes fear. Today, to speak a little bit deeper on this, is returning guest Reshie Joseph. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insight and your thoughts with us today.
Hello, Robert. It's very nice to be back. Thank you for having me back on your podcast.
No problem. I always begin with just talk about those who are around the world, whatever resources, whether it's a religious group or just a club or just family. I do encourage you to find help if you need it. But if you're in the States, 988 is a suicide crisis lifeline. I never like to reinvent the wheel. So if you could just ask this question with 3 words: I need help. Let's start from there. Get the help you need, especially if you are feeling overwhelmed. And I just want to share that with those who are listening, of course. So I always say this, Reshie. People say it better, obviously, than I do. There's a lot of people who've said some, very insightful things when we think about, taking that first step. Because we think about letting go sometimes, but it's beyond that. It's not just letting go. Sometimes it's what's next. I think that's the biggest question, especially, I've been working in the mental health field. Is, you get them stabilized, you get them through crisis, and then the question is, what is next? So Karl Barth says it this way: though no one can go back and make a brand new start, anyone can start from now and make a brand new ending. What comes to mind when you hear this quote, and any insight or anything you want to share regarding this topic of taking the next step, taking the first step?
Well, I think a couple of things come to mind when I hear this quotation that I hadn't read before from Karl Barth. I thought it was very interesting that you started your podcast today with that beautiful quote from the great Rosa Parks. I didn't know this was. Did you say it was Black Awareness Month or?
Black History Awareness Month. I think it's February or March. Around this time in the United States,
right.
we do
yeah,
remember them. So
yeah. So with due regard to that, I think when I hear a quote like this one, or when someone says something to me like this, or when they speak of new beginnings, or when they speak of this starting out fresh, I approach this both from a biological angle and from a psychological one, and also from an environmental or sociological. If I may start with a biological, I hope it doesn't sound too functionalist or too medical of me to say this, but when we talk about new beginnings or starting or making a substantial change of some kind, from a purely biological perspective, we're really talking about one chemical in the brain, and that chemical is known as dopamine. And I'm sure America leads the research on dopamine. The best research has been done there and continues to be done by very, very great individuals like Professor Anna Lemke at Stanford, who probably has written one of the better books recently. I speak, of course, of the book Dopamine Nation that she recently published. Now, why is this chemical so salient to this discussion? It is salient because amongst its many functions, it is responsible for creating that wondrous human capacity known as motivation. What we discovered almost by accident, and I shudder sometimes when I read this research because it would never be allowed in any university today. But 50 years ago, 70 years ago, it was sort of the Wild West. You could pretty much do anything. There were no blasted ethical committees to get around. And so what they did, one very famous research that they did was they just depleted the dopamine in the brains of rats and just to see what would happen. So they did. And what they did was they took these rats and they blocked all of the dopamine activity in the brains of these rats, and they put them in cages right next to a plentiful supply of food. And these rats starved to death, even though they were sitting right next to the food. And that was when we first discovered one of the most important things about this particular molecule, which is it's the molecule in your brain that tells you that's important, go do it. Which anyone in a discussion such as this one will immediately recognize that the first and most critical component of any kind of substantial change is the ability to say, that's important, go do it. If you don't have that, very difficult to initiate change. And if we want to see the human equivalent of severely dopamine depleted brains, one needs to look no further than rehabs that are all over the world, drug and alcohol rehabs. Now we know that addiction severely depletes dopamine activity in one particular circuit in the brain. We've got 4 circuits, but in this one particular circuit known as the reward circuit, more often called the motivation and salience circuits, the circuit in your brain that tells you that's really important, go do it. It sees food, tells you it's important, so you go look for it, you go find it, you eat it. And it does the same for sex, right? So it ensures our survival both individually and as a species, which is really the biological imperative. And if you look in rehabs, what you find are a lot of very restless, very listless, very bored, very amotivated and unmotivated individuals who sit around feeling very miserable, but with whom it's very, very difficult to motivate to get up and do something. And the reason for that is like these rats in the research of all, they have brains that are very severely dopamine depleted. And so the chemical that tells them this particular change is very important, you have to get up and do it, that chemical is missing. So why is this important? This is important because anything that enhances dopamine transmission, dopamine levels, and dopamine sensitivity in the brain, by definition, is going to make these brand new starts much, much more viable. The chemical ingredient that drives the new start, that drives people to make these new starts, that chemical is dopamine. And I like to think of this whole process as being broken into 4 different M's, 4 different parts. M1, M2, M3, and M4. And they don't have a sequential order. They all have different components, but the 4 different M's are memory, movement, memory, motivation, movement, and meaning. So, for example, if I'm walking past a shop, say, right, and I smell the delicious smell of barbecuing meat. I know we're very fond of barbecued meat in the US, so I'll use that. Okay, I walk past it. The first thing that happens is that it triggers a memory. Perhaps the memory it triggers is of a day as a boy in the backyard, and there's barbecuing meat, and there's lots of family, etc., etc., and it triggers that memory. That's the first step. The second step is that it motivates me. It makes me go, ooh, that smell, I want to go do that. I want to stop this business and I want to go do that, right? That's the second M. The third M is that it has to initiate movement. It has to be able to get me to get out of my comfort zone, or get out of my seat, or get out of whatever it is I'm doing and move towards that thing. And the final M is meaning. These things happen and they are able to generate this type of activity because on some level, that thing is meaningful. Now, in the case of food, it's not difficult to see what the meaning is. The meaning is if you eat, you live. Easy, right? In the case of sex, it's not difficult to see the meaning in that one as well. If you engage in sex, first of all, you'll have a terrific amount of fun doing it. And second of all, you'll allow the species to survive.
Yeah.
But in a discussion such as this, if we're trying to make a brand new start, if we're trying to initiate movement, motivation and memory, etc., it's what does this new start mean for me? And that's where we come into the psychological component, and I'll come to that in a minute. I just thought I would give you a chance to come back to me on the biology.
Yeah, I think that's obviously intriguing, because I remember reading those studies about the rats being depleted from dopamine, and like it's kind of daunting how much just one chemical just could stop everything. And I also, you led into the idea whenever I'm working with a client, I'm always like personalized. What I'm talking about is what does success mean to you? What does it mean to go kind of be better, and in the context? And a lot of times I notice, especially people who have been sick for a long time. Unfortunately, you got this construct of a maintaining wellness, but there's no forward progress. So the family sometimes can be their own barrier towards what they want, because they're just following the rules. So sometimes I find this problem to be unique, and I feel it's got to be, how would you say, creative. Problems are solved creatively, and I feel that a lot of times it takes a bit. I do think about the transitional period, because I do feel people get, they get the medication, they feel good, they start feeling like things are working, and then there's a stagnation that sometimes happens, and then they're just maintaining, and then taking the first step after that is like, hey, I'm doing good, I have the medication, I'm doing good. And like you're saying good too many times, what does that really mean to be good? So that's where I kind of like following suit of where I thought you were going with. So yeah, I do find it very intriguing. I do encourage the curiosity. I think curiosity, when I see people curious, kind of, I don't know, it gives me like, it feels like very healthy, but a healthy emotion to have the innate, like, have the motivation to be curious, and I feel it gives a more honest approach when you're trying to decipher some of these longer problems, not just that simpler, like, oh, it's easy to kind of see you can only eat a finite amount of food, so that's easy need to kind of but when it comes to these other more complex, I do find it a little bit it takes a little bit more, I know, so insight. So.
Yes, well, it's very interesting to hear you talk about it to frame it in that way, in the sense that if whatever program I'm in, right, if what is ultimately meaningful about that program, if what is able to generate movement, momentum, motivation, all of those other M's, if ultimately the meaning is I do it because it makes me feel better, that's one set. That's one set of meanings, if we can call it in that way. It's meaningful to me because it actually provides me, and this brings me onto the psychology of it. It brings me a positively reinforced. It brings me positive reinforcement. However, if I'm doing your program, Robert, because by doing it, what the meaning I extract from it is that it prevents me from feeling bad. That's a whole different set of motivation here. Robert says, right, you need to get up every morning, do some meditation, go for a walk. You put me on a set program, right? Yeah. And I'm doing it because, and the reason I do it is, its meaning to me is when I do it, it stops me from feeling ghastly, from feeling dreadful. The problem with that as a motivational construct is that if that is how I extract the meaning, as soon as I stop feeling dreadful, where's the meaning in this?
Yeah.
I mean, the whole reason why I started doing this is to stop feeling dreadful, right? Which is what a behavioral psychologist would call negative reinforcement, doing something to avoid the consequences of not doing it.
Yeah.
Great place to see negative reinforcement at work is Alcoholics Anonymous or any 12-step meeting. No one goes into an AA meeting skipping with joy, wanting to be there. Everyone goes in there because if they don't, the consequences are going to be really appalling. And so they go to avoid those consequences. The really key psychological transition, we know this for long-term behavior, from turning the brand new start into sustained change, is that a transition has to be made from negatively reinforced behavior to positively reinforced behavior. In other words, I start going to these meetings, these blasted meetings, because if I don't go, the wife will take the 5 kids and move to Iowa. Okay. And I don't want that. So I'll go. But at some point, is there a transition from that to, no, I now go to these meetings, or I now engage in Robert's program because I really believe that it adds value to my life, makes me feel better, makes me function better, and therefore the meaning has drastically changed. And I've often felt it working with people that transition point is where the person goes from being pushed to being pulled, where they've got me behind them, pushing them, to being able to generate that force almost internally, where they're being pulled along by their own internal force. And it subjectively feels that way for me, and I rather suspect it probably does for you as well.
Yeah, and it's I think just what you're saying and just our conversation, I do feel I remember with the civil rights, one of the things they would say is when it comes to the big change during the civil rights movements back in the time was not done organically, intentionally. It had to be done intentionally. A lot of these concepts, and I feel sometimes, especially mental health, and especially when there's gaps or even substance or dual diagnosis, is that we like to generalize to kind of soften it if someone is struggling. But sometimes what we're talking about with the transition is when accountability kind of changes to more of an empowerment than an accusatory kind of tone. It doesn't like the accountability becomes shifted from this, oh, I did something wrong, like the negative. But if I do this, I'm going to end up on the street. I'm going to do this. I'm going to be kicked out of my house. It becomes more like I want to do better. And that shift, a lot of times, I feel, at least I know, maybe you give your opinion on what you've seen. It happens what we do each day, the micro things we do each day. Me getting up every day, me doing the small things. A lot of times, even the small conversations. I used to say this because I was a church leader and I've done that. Is I used to have a big kind of gripe of all these people saying a lot of big, tall things, but I'm like, just call the person back. Like, that's it. Like, sometimes we make it like so complicated. Oh, this person, this. If you're going to promise someone something, or you want to really connect with someone, call them back. Listen to what they're going through, not tell them what you think they need to do. And I found that a lot more helpful in understanding not only how to help someone, but also, how to communicate as we, kind of strive forward in this. So any thoughts on that?
Well, that's beautifully said, Robert. That's beautifully said. I mean, we now have so much research that supports your proposition that the stern-faced, the stone-faced, finger-wagging, eyebrow narrowing, parental sort of that sort of negative reinforcement only gets you so far. If you frighten people sufficiently into doing your program, as long as you can keep the fear going, you'll keep people quiescent. But as soon as that motivator is removed, people will go right back to whatever it was they were doing. And then at some point, you will get so much more if you instead went for, if you would say an adherent of Carl Rogers, if you did, unconditional positive regard or some form of positive reinforcement, where you're unconsciously communicating to the person you're working with, it's worth your while doing this because you will feel better about being you. And once that really seeps into the bones, you've got your pulling force. You've really got them, right? That's a beautiful feeling. So I totally agree with you on that. And in terms of creating something that speaks to the simple rather than the grand, again, there's so much to support that. We know, for example, that most of human behavior exists within silos or systems or schemata that we call heuristics, right? So, for example, I remember when I was doing my master's and we were studying this particular subject in behavioral psychology, we were given a project and we were told, okay, when you wake up in the morning, if you brush your teeth first, don't do that, right? Do that last. If you wash your face first, don't do that. They just inverted the order of things in the morning. If you put on your left shoe first, put on your right shoe first. If you put on your jacket with your right sleeve first, do it the other way around. I remember doing that and it made me so uncomfortable for the whole day. Several times I had to stop, take off my jacket, it just demonstrated the power of these heuristic systems and that these really simple behaviors are all interconnected in a really powerful way. And I think that really speaks to what you're trying to say. If you really want to enact these brand new starts, if you really want to hook into motivation, meaning, movement, all the rest of it, you're much better off if you engage one of these heuristic systems, right? It's like saying to someone, well, I don't want you to eat in this restaurant, I want you to eat in that restaurant. But if the new restaurant, you walk into it and it doesn't have any waiters, it doesn't have any tables, it doesn't have any chairs, it only has 3 doors. You're going to walk into that restaurant and then you have no heuristic for dealing with it because there's nothing there you recognize. Whereas if you walk into a new restaurant that still has components of the old one, then what you're doing is you're hooking into all of the heuristics, all of the schemas that the person already has, and you're simply making subtle changes. And I think some of the heuristics that are very important to making these types of changes are availability, right? People will often do what is most available to them. And pretty much, we know this from the smoking cessation studies, right? The biggest predictor of smoking cessation is not any kind of program or drug. Biggest predictor is government taxation, simply because by increasing the tax, you make it less available. Yeah. And simply by putting up the tax, you make it less available to a whole segment of the population who now can't afford it. And just that alone gives you the best results, just by decreasing the availability heuristic. So if I want to get someone to go to the gym, if I make the gym 3 blocks away, he's far more likely to do it than if I make it 10 blocks and 2 train rides away, So that's one. Familiarity is another. People will often do what is most familiar to them, even if it's highly, highly dysfunctional. And we see this in relationships, do we not, Robert?
Yes.
Right? They will stay in familiar surroundings. Who was it? It was a very great American writer who wrote that people will very often prefer the tyranny than the promise of freedom, simply out of reluctance to do the hard work necessary. I think it may have been Thomas Paine. I'm not entirely sure who said that. Sounds like something that Paine might have written. But so familiarity. Another one that I've often found is very important in terms of heuristics is anchoring and attachment. People often like programs that allow them to feel anchored and feel grounded. There's something about that grounds them, that anchors them, that creates a sense of security and attachment. I think it's part of the reason why what you and I do if done well and done effectively, can be so powerful because it hooks into that heuristic. It allows people to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of attachment, a sense of grounding, and a sense of anchoring. And so, that very often is very powerful. And of course, there is the stuff that people write about in the construal level theory. If you create something that fits into someone's view of themselves, fits into someone's overall theory of themselves, then so for example, if you were creating a program for an African American audience, you're going to get much further if you were to have Rosa Parks and James Baldwin and W.E.B. Du Bois and people like that, right?
Yes.
Then if you were to say have, even very great Americans who may not have been African American, because it doesn't, you're fitting into a much more powerful heuristic. And so I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well, but this really speaks to the point that you made, which is whatever it is that we're trying to do to create these brand new starts, we're much, much more likely to succeed if we hook into these pre-existing patterns and utilize them, rather than the sort of the noblesse oblige, the sort of the grand gesture. Right?
Yeah. I kind of go with the model: you treat the person first, and then what they're going through, as opposed to treat the common saying. But we always kind of forget that. We're in the field, we're like, oh, there's all these things wrong with this person, but there's no really talk about the person. The person has a name, has a context. Historians doesn't get done really well, and you miss something if you don't listen to a lot of the context. You kind of miss an opportunity to get intact, to connect. And I feel that in itself has intangible values, that especially if we're trying to help them in any capacity, that sometimes gets overlooked, as we're kind of saying. Because I like to get to know my clients in every which way I can, and that may be helpful. And that context doesn't mean that I will help them, but maybe I could get them where they can get help. So that's where I try to do things. I don't know, just to move on with Alice Walker, I like this quote: the most common way people give up their power, and we're kind of saying this, is thinking they don't have any, or they only have two choices. Sometimes it's this dualistic kind of approach, like either I'm like this or I don't have anything, but they never really think through maybe a third option that's with the context that they have. What comes to mind when you hear this quote?
For me personally, when I look at this particular quote, whenever I see the word power used in a sentence like this, there is always the sensation of trauma behind it, and I'll explain what I mean. One of the key components of trauma is a nervous system that perceives threat, right? Which is where you get all these maladaptive behaviors and cognitions and etc. But at the center of that is a nervous system that believes itself to be threatened, either rightly or wrongly, and very often rightly. So if you look at traumatized populations, the African American population in the US, Jewish populations around the world, the perception is that we're really threatened here, right? And extending from that sensation, that perception of being really threatened, is also a sensation of utter powerlessness. Nasty people are coming to do nasty things, and I have no ability to stop that. And so the nervous system goes into either a freeze or a flight, or it goes into one of these very extreme states. And I often say that where the body goes, the mind will follow. So if the body goes into a flight state or a fight state or a free state, then the mind will follow that. And one of the classical components of threat-based thinking is the world becomes very black and white. Something, Robert, is either a tiger or it isn't.
Yeah.
There is no shade of gray. There is no in between. There is no, well, maybe it's a tiger, but it had a bit of a, it's cut its nails. I don't know. That does not happen. Something is either a threat or it is not a threat. And is it a case of giving up their power, or is it a case of that power has been wrenched away from them?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
albeit, many, many hundreds of years ago, but even so, as we understand more and more about transgenerational trauma, the lasting effects of that certainly can be seen today. And we can certainly see people who have a very profound and almost existential fear of being in that same state of powerlessness, who will pretty much do anything and everything to prevent that, to not give that up. And so they have a system of thinking that says to them, there are only two options. It's either I win or you win. It's either, if you're the tiger, then one of us has to win and one of us has to lose. That's just how it is. And that what you're talking about really is getting people out of that threat-based thinking into what I like to think of as the shades of gray thinking. Maybe this isn't about tigers or neighboring tribes coming to steal our food, or anything like that. Maybe this is about two sets of people trying to find their way in a complex world, and that there is a third way, a different way, a shade of gray, that a common ground that unites us. But in order to get there, we have to get people out of threat-based thinking. And to get people out of threat-based thinking, we have to get them out of feeling threatened. If they feel threatened, they will think threatened. And if they think threatened, they will behave accordingly. I don't know if I don't know if that's a succinct answer.
No, I totally, especially experiencing trauma myself and understand going through therapies myself. I understand that, people used to ask me what is having trauma like. Well, it's like you experience the same level of fear you would have if you're threatened, but it happens in the most inconvenient times. It could just be some song, something someone says, something that, and it becomes, like you said, black and white. You start thinking that way. It's either this or that. It's, a lot of the, survival kind of TV shows or stuff that we kind of know are kind of, a lot of story hinges on that, on the idea that, we have to survive, but there's never really why at this point, especially how bleak those post-apocalyptic movies and stuff are. There's never like, oh, so we're gonna just survive. But at the same time, there's some sort of I find, like, for me, when it comes to like perception and how obviously it's getting to that, out of that fear state, out of that threatened state, but ideas, knowing that emotions are what they are, really. What are they? They're not usually accurate, and that's okay. But at the same time, even though it's not accurate, you don't ignore it either. So the thing is, if I'm sad or angry and I find out that my friend just wasn't able to come, and, well, don't just stop there. Find out why that was such a big problem, and that insight, I feel, has been helpful for myself. Also, just kind of diving deeper. But I do want to, obviously this is really, really great, this conversation, how it's going. But I want to give a moment and give you a moment. You're a returning guest. Give an opportunity to give us a little update. After that, we'll continue. Anything you want to share with your audience, with the audience listening today?
Well, I think the biggest update. I mean, I'm a year older. I don't know if I can say. I have an interesting story about that. I was at an alumni function where I felt very old, I must say, amongst the 20-something-year-olds. I'm 53, by the way. And I was standing next to an impossibly young lady, just impossibly young people. And so I was asked, clearly one of the older chaps here, how old are you? And I said, I'm 53. And her rejoinder was, oh, you don't look your age. To which I ruefully replied, well, 20 years ago, if a lady wanted to pay me a compliment, she would pay me a compliment. She would say, you look great. Nice suit. I like the cut of your jib, whatever, right? But these days, the compliments I get are, well, you don't look your age. I don't know about you, Robert, but there's just something about that I just can't quite relish. I mean, as nicely said as it was, I just don't relish that. Something vaguely about scraping the bottom of the barrel about that one. But I don't know why, but that's my update. A year older, feeling my age, but actually that's okay. Otherwise, I'm very much as you found me.
It's good to have you back, Reshie. And it's one all the time. Whenever I have people coming back, I want to give them an opportunity to update. 1 year older, that's 1 year. That's always for me. I feel like from a year for me, it's just been continuing doing what I'm doing, and I just love it. I just love what I do, and for me, I think about a lot of times, a lot of times people. I remember when I was first struggling. Maybe you could understand a little bit. You try to get everyone to understand what you're going through, and that's like the biggest waste of time for me. Because the thing is, at the end of it, you're like, I'm not feeling better. I just feel exhausted by explaining something that no one will understand. Period. And eventually, I was quiet, and I just started working, obviously, certain programs and learning certain techniques like mindfulness and certain other techniques that kind of help me through kind of being myself an observer, getting out of that threatened stage and seeing that, there's certain gray areas or certain areas that I can start really thinking of what are these negative thoughts or cognitive distortions that I may be kind of letting in. And these things are continue to happen. But, the funny thing is one person said to me, and I think it kind of holds true, life, and whenever I feel like, oh, I should be somewhere else, I should be further or whatever, like our lives are always unfinished completely. Every single time we think about it, it's always kind of the continuous thing. I get somewhere, kind of reminds me of the Beatles, how they say, life is in between what we're planning. So it's really understanding that, at least for me, I kind of like to keep it light sometimes, in the sense that human beings are the most, impressive and unimpressive people at the same time. It's kind of one of those catch-22. So I do find it's okay to laugh a little bit of time. I remember this one Italian proverb. I've been looking at certain proverbs. I thought it was kind of interesting. If you can't live longer, live deeper. I feel that a lot of times we're afraid of going deeper. A lot of times when we think about what's next or what we should do, I find, if I feel like, I have this issue, and a lot of times it's like I try to look at other people and what they did. Well, I try not to do that. I try to, obviously I get context, but I also take the time to see why it's happened to me. And if it's something that's continues to happen and I'm not able, I'll get help or find some means to address it. But when I don't know, I like these proverbs. There's one other one I'm going to share real quick. It's a Chinese proverb. So the bird does not sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. I find that poetically kind of deep, but I don't know. I just wanted to share this as we kind of continue moving forward on talking about taking those first steps. Any comment or anything you want to add?
Lots. And if this traces back to what we first began with, which is what is it exactly that makes all of this stuff meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about struggle, or the essence of struggle, as an attempt to explain oneself.
Mm-hmm.
The attempt to explain oneself to the people one loves.
Mm-hmm.
And the feeling of ennui and anomie and despair that comes when that process is unsuccessful.
Mm-hmm.
Banging one's head against the wall, thinking, how do I make you see this? Which is why I think taking that first step very often involves, this is where the social psychology side of it, or the sociological component, comes into it. it's not just about having the song to sing, but it's about the people who listen to
Yeah.
the song and our perception that they really get it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that community is so important, and the lengths to which we will go to preserve and protect those communities, quite startling, really. And that sometimes those communities can be very good things, but sometimes they can be very destructive ones as well.
Yeah.
And how people will sacrifice almost anything to belong to those communities because it gives them perhaps the most powerful meaning of all. That it's on some level speaks to our capacity to be human almost,
Yeah.
that we are, that we are the community we belong to.
Yeah.
Whether that community happens to be a nurturing, expansive, supportive, uh, a beautiful, thing, or its corollary, if it's a destructive and fascistic and nasty community. But it is the pull of the community, I think, best really adumbrated by Emil Durkheim, where he says, and I don't think he says so fancifully, where really, the meaning of human society is the meaning of being human, and if you deprive humans of that, your eventual outcome is suicide, both on the personal level as well as on the societal level. If people don't have a buy into the communities that they are part of, they have no reason to preserve either those communities or themselves. That really our sense of self, our identity, is partly derived from the communities we belong to. So yes, song is important, but I think the people who listen to that song are perhaps as important, if not more so.
Yeah. The old adage that we're not islands. I do think there's the balance. Obviously, I'm still of having internal validation, but you still need that external validation. It's just kind of having it not be the only thing. Like, I cannot be only hinged to be happy if someone else says that I'm okay to be happy, or someone be a part of my life. If they're not part of my life, then I'm not validated. But at the same time, it's like you said, questions are best answered together. Like, I remember there's one African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. That kind of, I like that one. Made me think of what you're saying. A last question as we kind of wrap up, Reshie, what has been the biggest lesson you've learned or maybe have seen when it comes to starting over? It could be your own personal testimony or something else you've seen working with people that you want to share today.
If I had one lesson that I would want to communicate in anyone who is trying to make a change, both big or small or both, start over in some way, your best chances of succeeding are if you attend to the biological, the psychological, and the social. Meaning, if you had something that biologically enhanced dopamine functioning in your brain, which keeps your motivation high, allows you to move, set targets and go after them, chase them, in the way that, say, someone like Anna Lemke advocates for in her beautiful book. If you can dial that in, if you can dial in the psychological component, of which you spoke of very well, unconditional positive regard, creating positive reinforcement, hooking into heuristics, etc. And if you can ally yourself to a community that supports you in singing that particular song, the new song you want to sing, in other words, if you can do all three of these things, the chances that you're starting over is not just a flash in the pan, that the new start becomes a new beginning and extends itself into lasting change, which I think is what we're really talking about. If you can do those three things, you're just that much more likely to succeed.
I just want to say thank you, Reshie, for coming on and sharing your insight Any little final thoughts, like words or anything you want to share as we close? I just really appreciate you coming on, Reshie.
No, I think that's those were really my final thoughts. I'm just very happy to be on the show with you again, Robert. It's always very nice to see you. And a final thought, if there is one, is just how small our world has become. That someone in America can be talking to someone in the Far East as easily as we are. I mean, how marvelous is that?
That in itself, I just, a lot of times I'm just, we kind of focus on the negative things. Obviously, there are gonna, if we look at the increase of, increase of information we are, and the saturation of information that's out there. But one thing I try to focus on is on the understanding of it. And I appreciate you kind of coming on and sharing your thoughts, and so we can understand a little bit better what it means. Obviously, not what we say is finite, but I do encourage all those listening, find what helps, get help. If there's something that is you're struggling with, go around to what community makes you feel that they have the best interest for you. Don't. And lastly, if you are overwhelmed, I do encourage you this. Tell someone today. And I just want to say thank you, Reshie, for coming on. And I want to say to those who are listening, go to reviveministriesfl.com. That's our website. It's a goodbye from Revive Ministry Podcast. Leaving last quote. It's from a Pakistani proverb. I've been doing proverbs lately. It says, "Pride is concerned with who is right. Humility is concerned with what is right."